So I'd like to welcome our distinguished keynote speaker for the day, Charles Acklin, who is not only a terrific guest in this conference, who's been asking a lot of really great questions in all the keynotes and panels, but Charles Acklin is also Distinguished University Research Professor at Concordia University and currently the chair of the Department of Communication Studies. His book include Screen Traffic, Movies, Multiplexes, and Global Culture, and Swift Viewing, The Popular Life of Subliminal Influence from 2012. He edited Residual Media, 2007, and co-edited with Heidi Wasson, Useful Cinema in 2011. Acklin was an editor of the Canadian Journal of Film Studies, 2008 to 2014. His most recent monograph, which I think we'll mention today in the keynote, American Blockbuster Movies, Technology Wonder, has just been released by Duke University Press. Thank you again, Charles, for agreeing to take part in this event, and I give you the floor.
Sorry, I was pressing the button, it wasn't unmuting. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was really terrific. I really appreciate that. And look, you know, I really want to thank all of the scientific committee that's been working on this conference. Alana, Philippe, Carl, Caroline, Santiago, and I have one here that Thomas. And Dan, the work that he's put in. I mean, I really understand that organizing something like this is, under these circumstances, is really complex, and everything that you've done in terms of the technological architecture, as well as all of the attention to care, to inclusivity, the land acknowledgement. It's an absolute model of how one does this. So you're doing great, and you really know how to put on a good TV show, basically. So anyway, it's great. Thank you so much. Listen, I have to figure out how to do the share screen here. So just please tell me that I am doing it properly here. Tell me that you can see it.
We see it in the right format. Just the
is that good?
It's perfect.
I can continue?
Please.
Okay. Let me just move this over so I can see. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So look, I think that the first approach that many take when they think about immersivity is to usually think of it as some kind of successful or progressively more successful realization of the total artwork, something that surrounds and occupies the senses. Now, I understand why that might be the first approach, but this strikes me as a particularly functionalist way to conceptualize media and artistic experience. Instead, I wonder what it might mean if we think about immersivity as located in relationship to what it means to pay attention to one's environment. And I think that some of the presentations throughout the course of the symposium so far have tried to do that. That is to think about immersivity in relation to what it means to bring the dulled, unobserved background to the front of our consciousness, to examine it, to share it, to investigate those mechanisms that direct us to see something as unified, complete, some kind of unified or complete rendition. So when we approach immersivity, however compelled we may be to embrace an idea of totality in innovation, technological innovation, I propose that what we need to do is to be attentive to limits, to repetitions, to borders, to exclusions. Now, to do this, and what I'm going to present today, I focus on the material aspects of the technologies of immersion, as well as our expectations and ideas about them. Now, helping me think this through is some work of Ariel Rogers. She has a great essay from 2012 that's called "You Don't So Much Watch It as Download It, Conceptualizations of Digital Spectatorship." And in this, she shows us how what we understand of the changing cinematic experience is very much an encounter between technological conditions and how we describe them. That is, there are always attendant discourses at play in whatever it is that we experience in our media life, right? We never arrive at a media experience without having already encountered something that mediates that experience. I know directly relevant to what I'm going to discuss today, she charts the repetition of the dream of implanting images and experience as a special brand of immersive intersubjectivity. She points out that all new media forms, for all their apparent advancements, and there are advancements, I'm not saying that there aren't, but nonetheless, there are elements that reinstate rather than upturn dominant sensibilities and priorities about technologies, about communities, and about experience. And I'm going to talk about this by working through a key element in the work of Douglas Trumbull. Now, Trumbull's singular and I would say unparalleled career as a motion picture innovator, producer, director, entrepreneur presents us with a body of work that has essentially established how the cinematic future is imagined. He has had an astoundingly influential impact, in particular, on the look of the modern blockbuster movie, helping shape what an expensive, effects-driven movie looks like. In this, he's part of a larger historical turn that moved technology, special effects, and immersivity to the center of the highly capitalized mainstream American movie experience. This is something that I take up in my latest book, which was just mentioned, American Blockbuster, namely that the contemporary big budget movie is as much a showcase for technological possibility as it is a narrative, franchise, or star vehicle. Now, in appreciating and examining Trumbull, I could focus on his work in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or Blade Runner, or Silent Running. But I want to take a close look at his film, Brainstorm, from 1983. It's a feature that he directed and produced. Now, while itself, it was not a blockbuster success, Brainstorm is a miniature manifesto for a technological aesthetic, one that privileges attention not just to immersivity, but to the mechanics of the immersive experience. Now, Trumbull's artistic priorities were often not just to represent, but to construct audience experiences. Sensations have been key, and the metaphor of transportation is frequently used to describe the result. He helped define and delimit what we think of as the ride film or the ride sequence. Key work visualized the movement of spectators done in such a way that viewers also feel the movement as they are taken, quote unquote, some other place or time. This has resulted in some of the most memorable cinematic moments of future or extra-dimensional transportation. For instance, perhaps best remembered is the Stargate sequence, his contribution or one of his contributions to 2001, A Space Odyssey. The impact of that sequence, this experimental film interlude in the middle of this film, has been such that it has glued Trumbull's reputation to that film, to the point that the Italian release for his directorial debut, Silent Running, was 2002, La Seconda Odisea. But that extra-dimensional transportation is found in perhaps his least remembered contribution, the sequences that bookend the now cult classic movie Candy, which similarly represents a trippy journey through space and mind, which incidentally was released the same year as 2001. Now, scholar Julie Turnick has authoritatively documented contributions exactly of this kind. That is the merging of an experimental film focus on non-representational and visual dynamism with popular conventions of popular film, and saying that it rose in dominance in the 1970s, very much influenced by the kind of work that Trumbull did, and that it's been fixed there ever since as what Turnick calls the blockbuster aesthetic. Well, Brainstorm is an entire film that is about exactly the representation and experience of extra-dimensional travel. It addresses the implications of sharing experiences so intense that your own physical state seems to dissolve temporarily as you experience that of another. The story involves a team of technology innovators developing a device that can record brain activity or transmit it with absolute fidelity and intensity, and then play it back for yourself or for someone else who then shares that experience perfectly, a kind of brain wave recording transmitting device that can be transmitted. Right? Brainstorm is, in a way, a narrative exploration of that dream of the perfect, total immersive artwork. The plot elements involve corporate interference in innovation, military exploitation for the purposes of human manipulation. There are romantic complications, and there are explorations of the mysteries beyond life. Now, the film nails what I think we often see as the twinned technological obsessions with new technological forms, that is, with thrills, pornography, roller coasters, as well as death. One of the plot engines for the second half of the movie is that the lead scientist of our innovators, Lillian, played by Louise Fletcher, records her own death experience. And then our lead, Mike, played by Christopher Walken, fights to replay and experience it, which of course becomes an opportunity for us, the audience, to experience, to see it too. The film depicts this recorded experience. It's a very interesting and elaborate sequence. There are many different images, but some the more memorable ones include floating through what look like bubbles of memory, and then being greeted by angel-like figures. Now, I'll tell you, critics at the time, some of them commented on the imagery as somewhat cliche, and there was some voice of disappointment of what the imagining of beyond life was like. But it's interesting, when I read that, and I've gone over a lot of that material for this presentation, I always ask, were these critics really so taken by the film's concept that they really expected a report on life after death in the movie, only to be let down by what turns out to be a really good special effects sequence? In any case, the film mostly sticks with familiar narrative structure, focusing on a white man's pursuit of universal understanding. You might think that a more radical version of the conceit might have explored some manner of cross-identity exchange of subjectivity between genders, people of color, abilities. There's a very interesting, tantalizing moment of this early on when the brain recording device in the film is connected to a chimpanzee. And, but that depiction of cross-species intersubjectivity is shut down immediately as abhorrent and dangerous. This happens within the first few minutes of the film, effectively bumping us up against the limits of that particular approach. And there are other instances of male characters putting on the brain device of female characters, but mostly it's presented as something that is not productive, right? And so again, something that might have been explored differently in a different format. The film establishes two distinct representational modes, that of the story, that of the brain recording. But many instances break this down such that the brain record mode, if you will, seeps into the representational world of the film, and sometimes vice versa. Now, this instability is most pronounced in one jolting shot that suggests that a lasting change in the story, lasting change in brain, that there's some kind of lasting change in brain structure when, following experience of a taped psychotic episode, Mike shifts to the brain tape presentational mode, even though he no longer has the headgear on. And throughout the film, there are other hints of this new materiality of images. This puts Brainstorm, I think, in conversation with another 1983 release, David Cronenberg's study of the new flesh of images, Videodrome. Now, the flash of the film, and quite deliberately so, is found in the sequences that represent the brain recordings, and the characters, of course, as they experience them. Now, as figured in the film, the brain recordings are mostly an embodiment of the ostensible camera operator. It's not the artist or fabricator of the work that manufactures the experience, but the documentarian, right, who has recorded their experiences for another to share, including, as just mentioned, the experience of dying. This slide here shows a boardroom demonstration of the device. The demo reel includes things that would be very familiar in an early IMAX movie or in some of the Cinerama films that were discussed by Arun yesterday. It includes POV shots of roller coasters, sweeping touristic vistas, and a speeding truck speeding down what looks to me like the Pacific Coast Highway, but I don't know for sure that that's what it is. A speeding truck with an edit, quite dramatically so, to make it appear as though the truck sails off a cliff and then starts to fly. Through this, we cut to the board members responding to what they are seeing, which of course is what we're watching as an audience. Now, even as the newness of the technological advance is the focus of the story, it draws from all sorts of cinema conventions. There is editing in the recorded experiences for visceral effect, as I just described. There are dramatic and sometimes unmotivated shifts to third person away from POV, suggesting that in some way the mind's eye is rather like film montage. I suppose you could say the out-of-body death experience is motivated, but there are other instances that seem to violate this third person perspective. The recordings themselves are stored on what look like tape reels and shelving. The tapes are edited with procedures that look very much like analog film editing. And there's even some production lingo that's used for instance, right at the beginning, when our scientists, our innovators get the adjustment that they want, they're told to slate it with what looks like a clapperboard. Now, I want to locate this film specifically in 1983, the year it was released, and to think of this as, in some ways, a crossroads for ideas about popular moving image experience. The initial reception was almost uniformly mentions the production complications that resulted from the death of one of its stars, Natalie Wood, before shooting had completed. MGM wanted to shut down the production, claim the insurance money. Trumbull fought this vigorously and won the right to complete the film, though this required substantial additional financial investment and some additional shooting. The popular press and the trade press covered the production situation relatively closely, with headlines like "Brainstorm may never be finished," "The battle to save the film," "Cameras rolling again." I say this because when released, the story of Brainstorm was also the story of Wood, her tragic death, having drowned under suspicious circumstances, and this, her last film. The film grossed just over $3 million that year in domestic rentals, which did not cover its production budget. But indulge me for a second here. Take a look at this. This is the movie listing page 3 weeks into the release of the film. This is actually a little biographical detail. This was the weekend I saw the film, on October 23rd, 1983. And so this would have been the movie listing page I encountered, but this is basically what was in circulation third week into the film's release in Canada and the United States. So Brainstorm confronts not one James Bond movie, but 2 James Bond movies. It's facing not one Tom Cruise movie, but 2 Tom Cruise movies. Throw into that a Star Wars movie. Remember, these are all new movies, right? These are new releases. Add to that new releases from Woody Allen, from David Cronenberg, from Peter Greenaway, from Oshima, from Sam Peckinpah, still making movies at this time. We have The Big Chill, which was released the same weekend as Brainstorm and was a big sleeper hit. And of course, we have The Right Stuff, which is just about to be released and become a big blockbuster success. And of course, there's a film that was, for the most part, not on people's radar, have been quite neglected. And from this weekend on, gathered steam to become considered one of the greatest movies of all time, was released, Vertigo. All I'm saying is, if you take a look at this, I think that this is not a particularly distinctive weekend in the 1980s. However, I think that any distributor today would look at this lineup and say, you know what, I'm not going to release my movie into this cluttered, crowded field. There was, in terms of some of the reasons for its underwhelming box office, one commenter in Film Comment felt that the film was hampered, this is a quote, hampered by ads that looked as if they were pushing the newest Sony Walkman. Again, another technology that locates us in the early 80s. This is an example of the ads. This is a trade ad, but trade version of the ad, but the versions of this appeared in other sources as well in the marketing. You know, if you look at this though, what's interesting is that this is not a character in the movie, right? This is an effort to depict audience and audience experience, right? And again, experience of this particular futuristic device. In this way, the ads are they actually echo some of the things that were discussed by Ode on Monday, as well as Irene yesterday, in terms of Cinerama and other kinds of films that try to present not only the film that they're advertising or trying to drum up some interest in, but also the audience engagement with that. So for instance, this image from the Cinerama publicity, where you don't just see the image, you see the audience's relationship to the image. And in many ways, this is what the Brainstorm publicity was trying to do. This facet, I think, is key to the entire film and its production context. That is the technological reflexivity that is presented here in pursuit of some kind of reimagined motion picture experience. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 different layers of that reflexivity. The first that I want to address is an oblique cinematic appeal to sensory transport and intersubjectivity. Now, forget that futuristic device in the movie. The virtuality of recorded and shared experience sounds very much like the way moving images have always worked and been comprehended, right? And this is something that was pointed out yesterday in one of the comments. Let's take a closer look at the tagline of the film's marketing. The door to the mind is open. Imagine a videotape. There's our 1983 context again. Imagine a videotape that can record your thoughts and experiences. In fact, anything you can imagine. Then let you relive and share the adventure again and again. Now, looking at the recording playback transmission device as it appears in the film, our most immediate parallel today would be virtual reality. And sure, there were versions, that term existed, there were versions, but this movie comes out still a few years before Jürgen Lanier's popularization of the term, right? That's more mid to late 1980s. At the time, the immediate reference would have been home video and home videotape. That would have been the contemporaneous idea that understood or captured personalized recording and moving image storage. And in fact, that movie listing page that I presented to you, on either side of that are pages and pages of advertisements for VCRs. But think of that ad's characterization: record thoughts and experiences, anything you can imagine, lets you relive and reshare. This could have described film, moving image, or essentially any other medium. The measures or discourses of progress and improvement, which we have, don't wash away a root impulse to document and circulate one's expression for the experience of others, whatever the format. Cultural artifacts are time capsules. They freeze the look and feel of a moment, allowing disparate populations to tap into their sensibilities later and elsewhere. To take one aspect of Brainstorm, the casting, just the casting, is a fascinating intersection of career paths, one that we can access to some degree these many years later. Though, as Janet Maslin in the New York Times put it at the time, the real star of the film is the helmet. So we have Cliff Robertson as the military industrial exploiter, Louise Fletcher already mentioned as the scientist. They're basically at their acting plateaus. Walken's star is continuing to rise. I mentioned earlier, Dead Zone was in theaters at the time. So he had 2 movies that he was starring in release. And Natalie Wood was at the tail end of her career, she was already a face from the past before filming had started, right? Baked into this artifact, and again, Brainstorm isn't unique in this respect, right? Baked into this artifact then is a story of temporal fluidity of these performers and talents. Think about Wood, though, specifically. She died in 1981. Intense press coverage followed. This, her final film, was released 2 years later, essentially transporting audiences to the sensation of the deceased Natalie Wood's performance. This isn't just me, Mr. Media Scholar, saying this. The public discourse talks about this. The Miami Herald, for instance, called the film a ghoulish attraction. Some accused MGM of exploitive treatment for the purpose of promotion, including a dedication in the film to her right at the end. Almost to a one, articles and reviews address the film's far-out futuristic representation of the brain sharing, brain recording, brain sharing, sharing of brain activity, and the journey beyond life, and then discuss the Wood's appearance following her demise, as though in some way this was some kind of document that allows us to revisit that which is no longer living. These two observations you would think ought to be linked, but I couldn't find any place where they were. They do ask us to think not just about the sci-fi technology represented in the movie, but a fundamental of media ontology. To what extent do media make it possible for us to be there with the absent, right? This is a standard question that I think we rehearse and we investigate with all sorts of different forms. Okay, so that was the first layer. The second layer of technological reflexivity is Brainstorm's status as a historical artifact that sits at a crucial turning point in a parallel endeavor of Trumbull's, the development of a heightened immersive cinematic experience, first called Super 70 in the 70s, then called Future X, finally settling on ShowScan in 1981. Now, mostly what I'm presenting here is the product of trade research, research on trade publications, but there's a terrific synthesis and commentary on Trumbull's format experiments in Julie Turnick's essay, Removing the Pane of Glass, The Hobbit, 3D high frame rate filmmaking, and the rhetoric of digital convergence in film criticism. Now, ShowScan was to be a scalable, theater-specific environment with a screen that occupied a good deal of the audience's field of vision, and with specially prepared films shot and projected with at the high frame rate of 60 frames per second and in 70mm format. Doing so would reduce the flicker effect. It would produce intense clarity and sensation of presence, sometimes described as 3D without glasses, right? Excuse me. Various shorts and proof of concept films were made in this format by Trumbull and his associates. Their exhibitors and many investors were wowed by the results. There were some comments that it was such an unusual experience that it was difficult to assess what exactly people were watching or what the experience was like. But significant for our purposes here is that Brainstorm initially was to be shot and presented in ShowScan, specifically the sequences that represent the helmet recording device. They were to be shot at the high frame rate so that you would see the usual film at 48 frames per second. Then the helmet parts, the brain activity parts, would appear with unusual clarity and dimensionality at 60 frames per second and in 70mm. Interestingly, Turnick cites, let me correct that. All of that version of Brainstorm was to be shot in 70mm with just the alteration of the frames per second. Interestingly, Turnick cites Trumbull saying later that in the end, the alteration between frame rates, faster frame rates and slower frame rates, might be one of the better uses for the eventual adaptation of high frame rate filmmaking, such that only certain sequences would appear with that intense level of clarity. It's interesting because today what we're seeing, we're not seeing that, at least in terms of feature feature fiction. So when Ang Lee does Billy Ling's long halftime walk, or Peter Jackson does The Hobbit, they do the whole thing at the higher frame rate of, I believe it was 48 frames per second. So not as fast as what ShowScan was proposing, but doing the entire film rather than individual sequences. So Brainstorm, at least as initially designed, would have effectively been the calling card and publicity for that process, right? It would have been what I've called elsewhere a technological tentpole, selling not just the film, but also the mode of its representation, the mode of its presentation. As it turned out, the idea proved too big budget for all investors interested in Brainstorm. Without the exhibition infrastructure needed for such a presentational mode, this ShowScan aspect of the enterprise was simply too risky to pursue. But ShowScan did survive. Trumbull continued with the idea, and this to me is fascinating. After the multi-year struggle to complete Brainstorm, within weeks of its release, really just a few weeks, I think it was in October, Trumbull is publicly declaring he doesn't want to make any more studio features, any more studio films, and he launches and begins to push another set of deals that will roll out ShowScan in earnest. From this point on, Trumbull concentrates more intently on films for rides, site-specific locations, theme parks, casinos, hotels. Many in ShowScan. He later oversees IMAX's rapid expansion in the 1990s and continues with a similar approach to filmmaking with ShowScan into the digital era. Now, I began by describing Brainstorm as a mini manifesto for technological aesthetic, but it was pointing the way beyond the Hollywood blockbuster franchise, even as that was just being fortified. Right? This was just before a recognition that in 1983, recognition that competition with home entertainment and the deterioration of the theatrical environment would necessitate a reimagining of moviegoing, which actually does happen in the 1990s with the megaplex, at least in terms of from the perspective of exhibitors. Trumbull was an early voice on this count, saying that cinema was, quote, multiplexing itself to death by not paying attention to spectatorial conditions, reluctant to innovate, and allowing the degradation of the movie experience. In Box Office magazine, that's the main exhibitor trade publication, he argued further that the coming of HDTV, and this argument actually appears in 1986, which you should note is before that home format had any major consumer impact in Canada or the United States. He says that HDTV should push exhibitors to invest in a dramatically different image process and setting and not tinker with minor adjustments. So it's in this context that he's advancing ShowScan. So without the support of conventional exhibitors, Trumbull launches into an alternative ride film exhibition chain, Showbiz Pizza Parlor, with financial support from Robert Brock of the Chuck E. Cheese franchise fame. This includes a deal with Click Theaters for 30 ShowScan sites over the next 2 years. That was in 1985. The Showbiz, the Pizza Parlor may not have had the compactness and the sleekness of the recording playback helmet in Brainstorm, but they do echo each other in their intent to document, to magnify, and to share overwhelming moving image sensation. Just for a second, let's just return before I go on to the next layer of reflexivity. Let me return to this movie page, right? This is an artifact of infrastructure, right? It is a document of built spaces and technological facilities. It represents a moment in the mutable history of relations among producers, distributors, and exhibitors. And it outlines a stage, a platform for an encounter between audiences, their hometown, and internationally circulating culture. When Trumbull works to build an alternative format venue and audience for ShowScan, this is the configuration that's being responded to. All right. Now, the first layer, as I described it, involved a kind of core element of mediated experience offered by film that was given a sharper focus with the paratextual commentary, the commentary around the film about Natalie Wood's death. The second layer, this is a film about a new format for hyperfidelity immediated experience, which also involves an outside, a paratextual attention to the development of a new format for hyperfidelity immediated experience. The third, and the last one I'm going to talk about, involves the actual presentational format of the completed work of Brainstorm. When it became clear that a high frame rate version would not work to signal the shift between the recorded sequences and the diegetic story, some other materialist component had to be settled upon. This in order to realize Trumbull's commitment to not only representational, but experiential aesthetics. In the end, the alteration between film world and brain recordings were signaled by a shift from 35 millimeter to 70 millimeter, from that first aspect ratio to the second aspect ratio, from mono sound to Dolby sound. The theatrical release presents the diegetic reel of the drama in the more conventional audiovisual format, the more familiar one, and then switches to the more expansive, shall we say immersive, 70 millimeter widescreen stereo for those helmeted experiences. The Brainstorm thesis, if you will, is that the representational reel is less overwhelming of the senses than the proxy recorded experience. The diegetic technology of the helmet marks the experiential immediacy of shared brain activity. That record, that memory shared, that experience stored, is represented by technological spectacularization, expansion, amplification. The entire situation, everything you're watching is, of course, a staged dramatic record. I probably don't have to say this, but the audience isn't really putting on and taking off headgear, right? The curious element here is that everything in the movie points to the technology. It's in the publicity. It's the character's focus. It's the obsession of the corporate and military agents in the story. And it is the most extravagant element of the work's construction. More than this, we're supposed to share the character's experience of the device, which itself is strategically and directly referenced. We see images of characters experiencing those immersive brain sequences that we, the audience, also see, and we're told directly to consider the experience that is about to happen or is just about or has just unfurled. Right? There's talk of this throughout the film. The film proposes that conventional realist narrative form is outside that part of the story. That's the transparent representational mode, mono and 35 millimeter. The only way helmet tech can appear, can be distinct from that transparent mode is by pointing to a more pronounced appearance of cinema technology, situating the large, the loud, with the representational fidelity of the brain recordings. The headgear is equated with the technology of immersive cinematic spectacle, 70 millimeter widescreen, Dolby sound. The quotidian, the romantic, the corporate intrigue is realist technological invisibility. Now, this sign of future media as the experience of this manifestation, representation of immersivity, again, in actuality, 70 millimeter and stereo, is the material heart of the film as initially released. The year before, 1982, exhibitors had unusual success with 70 millimeter releases. There were apparently more 70 millimeter prints in circulation than ever before. Box Office referred to the coming summer of 1983 as the summer of Blockbuster, estimating that so many sites had converted back to 70 millimeter that the number of sites that were equipped was reaching the peak of 70 millimeters adaptation, which was back in the 1960s. The conversion, and remember, these are the same exhibitors that could not be counted on converting to show scan They did invest in 70mm facilities. ShowScan would have been more expensive, to be fair. This was to handle what was going to be and what was a record number of 70mm prints in circulation throughout not just that summer, but through the entirety of 1983. In fact, I have one source that says that Brainstorm opened on 170 theaters. Oops, yes, there we go. On 170 theaters, which would have meant that was roughly 40% of all American and Canadian 70mm equipped sites were showing that one movie. You may have noticed too that the movie listing page that I showed, it was probably too hard to see, but Brainstorm is the only one that lists pricing, and that's because the pricing was higher than the usual admission price. Now, I don't know how widespread that was, but certainly it is something that we're familiar with now, the idea that a premium theatrical experience has a premium price to match. And this, of course, was the case with some other theatrical experiments in the past, like Cinerama, as was mentioned yesterday. The slide that you're looking at is my attempt to give you as full a depiction of that shift that you would be experiencing if you saw that original release. I actually had I used a ruler to sort of measure each of the sizes of that image. So it's not very effective, I'm sure, but nonetheless, that was my attempt to show the diegetic reel of the bottom image, and then when it shifts to that brain perspective, it goes to that wider. It goes to that wider image. All right. There we go. The experience of the new media format in Brainstorm, the fictional near future experience recorder, relied upon an existing and at the time rejuvenated infrastructure of 70mm. This is the moment at which the imagination hits the actuality of our world. It collides with the actuality of existing economic and social conditions. Think of it this way. Every new media form and innovation is a chronicle of existing, residual, and persisting ideas about media, technology, and social relations. In the film, the representation of the new relies on other media, figured as videotape, film reels, physical splicing. The film recording, and that's part of what gives it that near future feel, right? The brain recording episodes designed to construct an immersive experience, right, of heightened, individualized point of view camera work, still lapses into third person editing, montage, again, returning us to a familiar cinematic language shared with the reel of the film story. For example, the final image, as the credits begin to roll, places our reunited couple, sorry, I guess I should have given a spoiler alert, but our reunited couple in the memory bubble for all eternity, presumably, as though we are now in brain recording mode or playback mode, which we're not, right? These violations notwithstanding, the alternation between formats, 35mm to 70mm, smaller to wider aspect ratio, mono sound to stereo sound, exclusive third person observational continuity storytelling, to mostly POV, though displaying moments of conventional realist construction. All of this provides a heightened awareness to the mechanics and technologies of the media form. So my conclusion here is that part of the experience then is that of becoming immersed rather than the experience of immersivity itself. Thank you.